you to the second Eastern Massachusetts Historical Commission Coalition meeting. During our presentations, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A section, which is down at the bottom. And at the end of all three presentations, we will have time for a Q&A session and everything. And yes, the meeting and presentations are going to be recorded. They are recorded right now and will be posted to the MAPC YouTube page and posted to the Eastern Mass page on the MAPC website. And as a reminder, so I don't forget at the end of this meeting, our next meeting will be Tuesday, October 3rd. We don't have a topic for that, but that will be Tuesday, October 3rd, most likely at 10 a.m., just like the last two. And today we are joined by Nathan Carlucci and Emma Snellings from the newly renamed Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which oversees the implementation of 3A, the MBTA Communities Act. And we also have Jake Collins, who's the Preservation Planner for the town of Brookline, and Andrea Bates, the Assistant Town Planner for Ipswich. And they both will be speaking about their town's approach to 3A and their historic preservation considerations. And we are also joined by my colleague, Emma Battaglia, who is MAPC's 3A coordinator, who's going to start by saying a few words about MAPC's work on 3A before we turn it over to Nathan and the HLC team.
Thanks, Lindsay. Again, my name is Emma Battaglia. I'm a senior housing and land use planner with MAPC, the regional planning authority for pretty much all of Eastern Massachusetts. And I'm helping to coordinate the work that we're doing around Section 3A, both internally with other MAP staff across departments and also with other external entities like EOHLC, formerly DHCD, Mass Housing, MHP, et cetera. And really, our goal is to help the cities and towns in our region to make the zoning changes they need to make to comply with Section 3A, but result in equitable outcomes in mind, and also really try to leverage this smart growth opportunity to tie new housing growth to other policy objectives like affordable housing, walkability, historic preservation, expanded access to economic opportunities, et cetera. So our work is kind of spread out through a number of different efforts. We are working to convene the rapid transit communities cohort that are required to adopt their zoning by the end of this year. And so this is obviously, they're in a bit of a time crunch. So we're helping to, with compliance modeling, zoning scenarios, technical support with the economic feasibility analysis that DHCD just released information on. And we're also working, conducting technical assistance for a number of cities and towns. Right now we're working with Acton, Belmont, Essex, Maynard, Millis, and Nahant, and we're gonna start up a project with Ipswich that's in development. And all of these are, work to review current zoning, conduct neighborhood visioning, make recommendations, including design-related recommendations that certainly can, try to incorporate historic elements, and, eventually writing the zoning and helping to assist with local adoption. We've also helped Franklin, Rockport, and Scituate to complete some compliance model testing. But that's pretty much the extent of that work with those municipalities. And so again, we meet regularly with the state, and you might have also caught a couple of our webinars as a part of the MHP webinar series back in the fall. So I will hand it back over to Lindsay. And I just want to flag that, the majority of the communities that we are working with either have historic downtowns, or we are working in a context where, the communities want to integrate historic design features into the development that is going to result. So this is something we're really paying close attention to, and I'm excited for this conversation.
Thank you, Emma. So now we're going to turn it over to Nathan and Emma for our first of the three presentations.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Nate Carlucci. I'm the MBTA Communities Compliance Coordinator with EOHLC, our new name, and I'm here with Emma Snellings as well. Emma and I work exclusively on 3A implementation. I just wanted to, sorry, give me a second here. I need to exit full screen and have my notes out here. I did plan to make a quick introduction to our new name from DHCD, but hopefully you've all digested that by now. We are now a secretariat level agency, the Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. So we ask that everybody can try to recognize that new name and position, and I'll do my best to minimize how many times I say DHCD as well. If we could go to the next slide, please. So we often start these presentations with a little bit of an overview about the housing crisis and why we're doing things to allow for more housing production in the state. I think that everybody has that message right now. So instead of kind of making that case, I just want to talk a little bit about the role that Section 3A plays in solving the housing crisis. It's a piece of the puzzle. And it's really specific to zoning. It's not actually about housing production. It's about zoning. It sets forth a standard in municipal zoning ordinances and bylaws that communities have to meet in terms of how much multifamily housing they allow as of right in their zoning. And that's important because when multifamily housing is not allowed as of right, it's subject to time-consuming and expensive processes. And the costs that come with those processes are passed on to the buyers and renters of the new housing. So when you allow the housing as of right at a large sort of regional scale, you have opportunity to make the housing be more within reach to more people. I do want to say that we have plenty of objective and numerical standards in the compliance guidelines that sort of determine whether a community is in compliance with the law, but there's also a lot of opportunity for communities themselves to choose what the district looks like in their community. And so I'm really looking forward to hearing the next two speakers that can talk about some specific examples. But I think that some of the best districts focus on, as we've talked about, walkable neighborhoods that are climate friendly and located near transit stations when possible, and especially located near amenities and community resources. Next slide, please. So this is the entire text of Section 3A. I apologize for the boring slide here, but just to give a really quick overview, we only have 3 paragraphs, and only the first paragraph is really the meat of the zoning requirements of this law. The second paragraph tells you the funding sources that are in stake in terms of compliance, municipal compliance with the law. And finally, the last paragraph tasks our agency, EOHLC, with writing the guidelines that determine whether an MBTA community is in compliance with the law. Next slide. So the first thing to talk about is what actually is an MBTA community. And you could find a technical definition by going into the MBTA statute, chapter 161A. And after a lot of time, what you'd find out is it is the communities that are in the MBTA service district, but really a good rule of thumb that'll get you the right answer about 98, 99% of the time is that it's communities that have an MBTA fixed transit station within their boundaries and communities that are adjacent to the ones that do. So within the guidelines, we take this term MBTA community and we divide the MBTA communities into 4 additional categories based primarily on the transit that they have. So the 4 categories are rapid transit communities. They have a rapid transit station, commuter rail communities, basically that have a commuter rail station. And then about half of the communities, half of the 177 actually don't have a transit station within their boundaries. Those are either adjacent or adjacent small towns. I do want to note that even though it's half of the communities, it's a very small percentage of the overall capacity for housing within the law. We'll talk more about the size of districts that different communities have to have, but most of the housing requirements fall to the rapid transit and commuter rail communities. These categories also affect the district location requirements and the timelines for complying. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what multifamily housing looks like within Section 3A. And again, communities do have a lot of ability to kind of make it to their liking. But sometimes you might see an article maybe in the Boston Globe that'll say, you know, a community has to comply, and you'll see like a skyscraper. But you think about the definition of multifamily housing in the Zoning Act, it's a building with 3 or more residential dwelling units, or that definition can also be met if you have 2 duplexes on the same lot. You also have within this statute a gross density requirement of 15 units per acre. And that's what this graphic is intended to sort of reflect. So on the left side of the graphic, you see traditional detached single family homes. And on the right side of the graphic, you see this mid-rise apartment complex. Everything in the middle there is kind of like the development typologies that reflect what the law actually requires communities to allow in their zoning. So they might choose to allow more density, but the middle is what's required. Next, please. Probably the most important thing that the guidelines determine is what is reasonable size. You might remember the statute says that an MBTA community must have a district of reasonable size. The guidelines find that reasonable size consists of 2 factors. One of them is the land area. The other one is what we call unit capacity. Unit capacity is basically the number of multifamily units that are allowed in the zoning. In terms of land area, most communities have a requirement of 50 acres. And some communities might choose to meet their unit capacity with a land area that's different than 50 acres. But to just kind of talk about the context of 50 acres, it represents about 1/10 of the land area that falls within a half mile of a transit station. So in the graphic on the right, you can see the orange parcels are kind of made up to represent what 50 acres would look like in a 1/2 mile radius around a transit station. That being said, the amount of a district that's required to be located near the station varies based on how much developable land a community has near a transit station. So in no case is a community actually required to locate more than 25 acres in a single transit station area. More on that on the next slide. So this table on the left is really important. That concept that I just mentioned, the more station area that a community has, the more of its district is required to be located in the station area. And you see in the left side of the table is the number of acres of developable station area that a community has. And you see that when it's 400 to 600, half of the district must be located in that station area. That's why I'm saying that no station area needs to have more than 25 acres, because the only way you could be required to have more than 25 acres in a transit station area is if you have multiple transit stations. So there is a lot of opportunity if it feels like it's difficult to locate the district in the transit station area. There's a lot of opportunity to also locate a good amount of it elsewhere. And for the adjacent communities, they don't have a district location requirement, so those districts can be located anywhere. Next slide, please. I do want to talk quickly about affordable housing with Section 3A. The statute itself is actually silent on affordability, but the compliance guidelines introduce the ability for communities to require an affordable component in this zoning. So it's a tough needle to thread because the statute does not provide for affordability, but what the guidelines landed on is that they allow all communities to require that up to 10% of the units in the district are affordable to households earning up to 80% of area median income. There's also opportunity to require that there's a larger affordability component. And you might have heard Emma at the beginning of this talking about these economic feasibility analyses. Basically, the 2 ways to require more affordability are either to do it through a Chapter 40R smart growth zoning district, where we sort of have a separate, I wanted to say DHCD, EOHLC review process, or you can do it with support from an economic feasibility analysis. That's basically what we try to make a straightforward and simple analysis that'll demonstrate that the requirements are not going to really harm the housing production. I also want to mention that if for anyone that's familiar with Chapter 40B and the subsidized housing inventory, these affordable units are, for 3A purposes, are not required to be eligible for the SHI, and that means that a community can require workforce housing, which is affordable to area median incomes over 80%. Next slide, please. You want to talk quickly about what 3A doesn't do. It doesn't require the production of housing. It sets forth a standard that has to exist in the zoning. It really removes the zoning barriers to that production, and it doesn't require the communities to pay for any infrastructure for future development. The statute actually mentions the Wetlands Protection Act and Title V. So there's an understanding that what gets built in the district might be less than what the zoning allows because of those other requirements. For this group, I definitely want to mention that Section 3A does not supersede historic districts. There may be questions in our implementation as time goes on, and we have to figure out on our end, is a historic district affecting the capacity of a district, but there's never going to be a case where 3A would supersede the historic district. It also doesn't allow for municipalities to get a waiver or an exemption from the requirements. The guidelines really do a great job of taking a lot of information to make sure that every community has requirements that are based on the conditions in that community. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. By any means, it's every community is required to follow the law, but every community has requirements that are based on its local circumstances. Next, please. I also want to mention the compliance model you might have heard mentioned already. This is a new sort of groundbreaking tool that we're using that our partners helped us to develop, and it is going to basically evaluate how much housing is allowed in a zoning district. So it has a spatial component with GIS where it looks at the existing parcel configuration and the other conditions on the ground that can affect what can be built. And it also has a workbook component where somebody can enter the zoning restrictions and enter the parking requirements and things like that. And then the compliance model determines how many units could realistically be built on a parcel based on zoning restrictions. And I want to emphasize that because this is not a build-out analysis. So there are times where you might hear in a community that the compliance model is saying that many units can be built. And the way that this works, the more permissive zoning is, the more units the model is going to say can be built. As zoning ceases to be the barrier to housing, a build-out analysis would give you a much lower number. That when you have what seems like a realistically high number coming out of this compliance model, what that means is that you've removed the zoning barriers to housing. Next slide, please. So what can you do now? Many of you might be familiar with the action plans. The statute did not have an effective date. And so in the guidelines, we introduced this concept called interim compliance, where communities could file what we call an action plan. And that action plan would get them into this state of interim compliance until a later deadline when they have to actually adopt compliant zoning. So right now, almost every community has submitted an action plan. You can find that action plan on our website. When we approve an action plan, the action that we're approving is really just the schedule of activities that a community sets forth for developing its compliant zoning. But the plans do ask communities about what they're thinking in terms of their strategies to comply. So you can go on our website and read a little bit about that in any community's action plan. It's not, the approval of the plan is not an approval of the specific zoning strategy, but you can definitely learn a lot about what communities are thinking. So that's mass.gov/MBTA communities. Of course, we always encourage everybody to get involved at the local level to contribute towards planning the best possible district in your community. And be mindful that the district compliance deadline, the deadline for people to adopt compliant zoning for most communities is December 31st, 2024. The 12 rapid transit communities have a much faster deadline at the end of this year, 2023, and the 35 adjacent small towns get an extra year until the end of 2025. Next slide, please. So I think that does it for my part of the presentation. I know you guys will have a chance for the Q&A afterwards, and I also want to encourage people to reach out to our program staff. We have this email address. I put 2 asterisks there, dhcd3a@mass.gov. I don't know if that email address is going to change to something like EOHLC3a@mass.gov, but for the time being, you can count on reaching us at dhcd3a@mass.gov. I think that's all I've got.
Thank you. Really appreciated that, Nathan. Nate. Okay, so now our next speaker is going to be Jake from Brookline. Okay.
Let me get this going. Oop. Okay. Everybody see my screen? We got a thumbs up from Lindsay, so I'll take that as a yes. First off, I want to thank Jeff, Lindsay, and Jennifer for hosting this conversation this morning. I'm excited to present the opportunity, to present the Brookline Village component of the Brookline Planning Department's approach to 3A. This is kind of uncharted territory for all of us, and it's great that we have this collaborative atmosphere to kind of dissect it and go through it together. So before I begin my presentation, I want to give a brief overview of Brookline. Brookline is a town of roughly 63,000 people. Yes, a town, surrounded by 3 sides on Boston. The median household income in 2021 was just over $122,000. And in May 2023, the median sale price for a home was just over $1.1 million. The town is comprised of many distinct neighborhoods, each with their own feeling, but the town can generally be divided into 2 sections. The north, which is more densely populated and features a wide array of building types, and the south, which is generally known for its larger single-family homes on expansive lots. We currently have 9 local historic districts and many national register districts and individually listed properties. I'm going to preface the conversation by noting that what I'm presenting today will be a component of the Planning Department's official proposal for 3A compliance. Approval of this plan requires an affirmative vote at town meeting, and it's looking like we may see alternate proposals. However, I do genuinely hope that our plans will ultimately satisfy everyone. We're going to start at the macro level, Harvard Street. So we started a discussion with an overview of Harvard Street, which is the area proposed for compliance. It is a north-south corridor that spans the majority of Brookline. It is intersected by 3 main major urban corridors: Route 9 to the south, Commonwealth Ave to the north, and Beacon Street at the center. Much of the street is commercial in nature and supplies basic necessities to residents of the surrounding neighborhoods in a walkable setting. Most importantly for this conversation, though, is the fact that it also intersects 3 Green Line stops, which makes it an ideal candidate for meeting the 3A requirements. As the street was originally laid out in 1661, you can imagine the amount of historic properties, both inventoried and not, that line it. So these photographs show a variety of different building types on Harvard Street. We have mid-century single-story supermarkets on very large lots, 3-story apartment buildings, and commercial blocks. The area, particularly the portion in North Brookline, has long been of concern to the Brookline Preservation Commission, as we have seen several 40B projects that have been poorly received by the public and numerous demolitions in the surrounding neighborhoods. In fact, the Preservation Commission actually worked with planning staff in 2017 to create design guidelines that remain unrealized, or for this neighborhood that remain unrealized. Now we get to the fun part, the historic part, or the, I guess, documented historic part in the Brookline Village. So Brookline Village is marked as study area 1 on this map, and it's adjacent to the Brookline Village P-stop, which we can see right here. It is a rather large district and extends past Harvard Street on all sides. That being said, the strongest portion, the commercial core, is included in the 3A compliance model. So, of course, we need a little bit of significance to better understand the neighborhood. This is one of the town's oldest National Register districts. It was listed in 1979 under Criterion A for being the center of Brookline's 19th century transition from a rural village to a bustling suburb, and for its concentration of late 19th century and early 20th century high-style architecture, particularly its panel brick buildings. The area has undergone several transformations over its lifetime. Many of the single-story commercial blocks date from the 1910s to the 1930s. Buildings have been greatly altered. And I believe the newest building included in the district is actually Brookline Town Hall, which was constructed in the 1960s. Despite this, the district retains much of its integrity and offers a unified vista of a late 19th century commercial area that remains in active use. So what kind of preservationist would I be if I didn't have any historic photographs to share? But the real reason I share these is to give you an idea of what the district looked like at various points in time. At the top left, right here, we have a photograph that says it dates to the 70s, although it may be a bit earlier. The bottom left photograph is undated, but probably the 19th century. And then on the right, we have an additional 19th century view. So, you know, about what you'd expect from those time periods. And now we have current views. Here are two current views. So here is one looking up Washington and Harvard streets. And as you can see, I had to include the T-stop sign. The T station is right over to the right here. But as you can see, many of these 19th century resources are still extant, and the district remains intact and, in my opinion, is very, very legible. More photos, of course, but I do want to direct your attention to the first photo here on the left. This building is typical of what forms I like to call the core of the historic district. It's a 4-story mixed-use building that dates from 1875. And to me and many others in the community, this is the sweet spot from where inspiration should be drawn. It's constructed of beautiful red brick. It uses brick detailing that feels simultaneously classic and timeless, and has a strong cornice line that grounds it. But there's so much more to the building. If we look at it closely, we also see a 4-story building made of high-quality materials. We see a 1st-story storefront with expansive glass windows and no setbacks that invite people in. We see modestly sized residential units above. And even though it is one of the largest buildings on the street, it does feel human scaled. And these other photos are of other types of buildings in the district. So we have the 1-story commercial block that I explained, or that I referenced earlier. We have some pure residential. And then this one I had to include because it is kind of an outlier, but it's interesting. It's a single family, or I believe it's a 2-family residence from 1857. But for the purpose of this discussion, we are going to focus on the 1st floor commercial with residential above. So now that we have a better understanding of the history, it's time to look at the district from a contemporary lens. So why is this area so desirable now to planners and residents? It turns out it's for many of the same reasons that it was historically desirable. The area acts as a main street, offering both retail and basic services to residents. You can see both a post office and a bank in this photo, actually, and drawing visitors in. There's a restaurant, I believe it's over here, called Mahanyam, and it's been receiving a lot of press. If you haven't gone yet, I would highly recommend taking a trip to Brookline Village, walking around, and having some great Thai food there. It is walkable, it is inviting, it is architecturally interesting, it is everything that people want. Unfortunately, what makes it so desirable is not allowed under the current zoning code. So here on the left, we can see several examples of the buildings that form the core of Brookline Village. Although each building is unique, they're all of a similar scale and use a similar vocabulary, which adds a sense of coherence and consistency to the streetscape. If you direct your attention to the chart on the right, you can see that the top 4 buildings, so these 4 over here, it could not be constructed as of right, meaning without zoning relief today. They are all considered overbuilt for the site and exceed height maximums, even though they are some of the earliest buildings in the district and a key reason for the district's continued success over a century after construction. So you may be wondering what kind of protection has been implemented to keep the district so intact. The truth is not too much. Only the town's demolition delay bylaw, which can impose an 18-month demolition stay for significant properties with existing historic designation. So in addition to triggering demolition for partial or full demolition of the structure, demolition can also be triggered for the systematic removal, effacement, or destruction of character-defining features, generally understood to be windows, slate roofs, wall cladding, among other things, on properties eligible or for listing or listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Since this district is a National Register district, we can trigger demolition for alterations to character-defining features on every building. Although we are glad to have the demolition delay bylaw, it is not as strong and clear as we would like. If an applicant opts not to seek a lift of stay with the commission, the replacement building just has to follow zoning and building codes and any relief that the Zoning Board of Appeals is willing to grant. On the other hand, for those who do seek a lift and really want to work with the Preservation Commission to develop plans to protect the buildings, there is no design guidance, which can lead to an extended review period and creation of several rounds of plans, which can get very costly very quickly. And so here are just some additional diagrams and ways to trigger partial demolition. So it's interesting, it's a pretty strong demolition bylaw, and we review quite a few applications for partial demolition each week. So next, form-based code. So even with the limitations of the demolition delay bylaw, we still felt like we wanted to include Brookline Village in our 3A district. However, we knew that we needed additional protection. So we felt that form-based code approach would offer enough protection while still allowing the area to grow and retain its status as a commercial center well into the future. So you may be wondering what form-based code is. In the most basic of terms, it's regulating the building form as a way of zoning, the envelope. So with those buildings that we discussed that are technically too bulky based on floor area ratio and too tall, we could say that the buildings, instead of saying that, we could say that the buildings in the area could be up to 4 stories with a first floor storefront, can only have a minimal yard setback and maybe exclude on-site parking, suddenly making this style approvable as of right. On the right, you will see a dormer diagram taken from Somerville's form-based zoning code. As you can see, it sets clear dimensional guidelines that allow for more predictable development than traditional zoning. So while introducing form-based code might get us the scale we want, it alone does not necessarily guarantee that the design of the infill buildings or additions would be appropriate. We wanted to take it one step further by introducing design standards. These standards are not guidelines. They are not mere suggestions, but rather a mandate. They can include everything from upper story setbacks to cornice line requirements to specific materials and to dimension of decorative elements. So on this slide, you will find some benefits of these design standards. Streamlines review processes. Remember that we can trigger demolition by the systematic removal of features. By creating standards that do not trigger demolition, we can promote as of right responsible development. Make zoning understandable to everyone. Zoning codes can be bulky and opaque. By including clear, concise requirements and diagrams, not only will developers be able to understand what they're getting themselves into, but neighbors will have the comfort of knowing what their neighborhood will look like in the future. 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. The design review process occurs before the application is submitted. This allows design review at the staff level. It saves time for boards and commissioners, and they can now focus their effort on different projects. It also saves money and time for architects, developers, anyone involved in the process. Allows for predictable as of right development. Everyone knows what is expected from the architect who has been hired to work in the district, from the developer hoping to create and build something beautiful to the homeowners. Legally enforceable, as these are requirements, not suggestions that will be codified. There is no ambiguity and they can be enforced. That is perhaps the single most important thing about this. And then it gives the community more control over the design. Community outreach has given us some insight into what the neighborhood appreciates, and which we can draw design standards from. So I'm excited to be able to share the beginning of the guidelines that our consultant, Chris Skelly, has put together. So to begin, he walked the district and identified the character defining features, which are listed here. As you can see, it focuses not only on the character defining features of individual buildings, but also the streetscapes. So we have pedestrian scaled spaces, we have storefronts, we have height, all these really important qualities that give the district its feeling. So here we have our proposed table of contents, which I'm actually very glad to be able to share. I received it last week after my presentation was due, but I knew I had to update it to share this with everyone. So this is the proposed table of contents derived from the character defining features listed in the previous slide and the community's input. We are of course hopeful that people will choose to adapt existing buildings. So we offered more specific guidance towards like very specific elements that could be done without triggering demolition. To us, it incentivizes retaining these historic buildings. It allows for a more streamlined process. It's fantastic. As for the new infill, we expect that there will be infill in the building and in the district, and there are currently no vacant lots to my knowledge. So anyone who hopes to construct a new building in the district will unfortunately have to demolish an existing building. And while we can't prohibit demolitions, the standards listed in the right column are designed more to ensure that the replacement structures themselves are compatible without creating a false history. So that concludes my presentation. To summarize, form-based code design standards work for us because there's a fairly consistent streetscape. It can work in tandem with the town's demolition delay bylaw, and the most significant building form in the district happens to really work well with the 3A requirements. Form-based codes and design standards need to be clear and concise, enforceable, and tailored to each neighborhood or building type. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. That was really awesome. Really enjoyed learning about this. So next up is going to be Andrea Bates, who's the Assistant Town Planner for Ipswich.
Good morning. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Lindsay. Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Andrea Bates. I am the Assistant Planner for the Town of Ipswich. I appreciate MAPC, MHC, and Preservation Mass for giving us the opportunity today to talk about historical considerations in a 3A district. It's such an important conversation, and I know we're all still starting to learn about this. So hearing from Brookline and learning from the communities on the call has been really interesting and helpful, as unlike Brookline, Ipswich is just starting its work on 3A. So Ipswich is a commuter rail community and has until December 2024 next year to comply with 3A. And we've started work on 3A over the last couple of months. And one of the main threads of conversation that have cropped up as part of this initial 3A work is around Ipswich's history and historic preservation considerations. So we're really starting to talk about how we can comply with 3A with historic preservation in mind and at the forefront of our compliance. And then it spurred a really interesting conversation about other historic preservation considerations that we'd like to work on, not only as part of 3A, but also into the future beyond 3A compliance. So to start a little bit about Ipswich, Ipswich is a community located about halfway between Newburyport and Gloucester on the North Shore of Massachusetts on Cape Ann. We are a rural coastal community. We have almost about 14,000 residents. And interestingly, Ipswich, if you've not been up here, you should certainly come check out our community, because we actually have the largest number of first period homes in the country. And we have two commissions in town that are tasked with protecting and preserving Ipswich's history, archaeological assets, and real property assets. And those are our Historical Commission and our Architectural Preservation District Commission. So our Historical Commission, one of the Historical Commission's most important roles is in carrying out Ipswich's demolition review bylaw. So any building or structure that was constructed prior to 1915 in Ipswich is subject to a demolition review carried out by the Historical Commission. And we also have one architectural preservation district in our community. The architectural preservation district is actually located, much of it is located within the 3A, what's classified as the 3A station area. We have approximately 220 acres of our architectural preservation district, and we have an architectural preservation district commission that is tasked with preserving the streetscape and exterior architectural and design features of properties and buildings within that district. So how does 3A coincide with this in Ipswich, and what have we started to think about? Because again, we're sort of just kicking off this process, and we know that we must zone for the allowance of 971 units by right, 40% of which are located in the town center. And as I mentioned, not only is our architectural preservation district with some of our oldest and most historical homes located in this area, but also all of Ipswich's, we have 6 historic districts that are on the National Register, and all 6 of those districts are located within or very nearby to the station area. So in tandem with the historic preservation components of our community that we want to protect and preserve as part of 3A, we're also really centering design and streetscapes considerations as we're starting to think about the work that we'll undertake over the next year and a half. And who's doing this work? The planning department asked the town manager to appoint a task force that is constituted of 8 members of the community, including 1 historical commission member. We are extraordinarily lucky to have Lindsay Randall, who's hosting the call today, as an Ipswich resident who happens to be on the historical commission and who we got to, thankfully, in her free time as a hobby, participate on the 3A task force, because the planning department really felt that it was extraordinarily important to include the historical commission on the ground floor of doing this work with 3A, given as I'm sure many of the communities on the call today can relate, a lot of 3A districts, I'm sure the majority of them are located within historic areas. We wanted to make sure that was the center of the work that we're doing as we undertake this. So how's it been going with the first? We've had a couple of series of engagements so far preliminarily in the community, simply really to socialize 3A, start to educate the community about what this is and what they can anticipate working on and hearing from us over the next year and a half. And it's really been made very clear that we have a couple of action items that need to happen in tandem with 3A in order to successfully implement this for our community. So one of those is that one of the goals that has come out of these conversations is that we don't have a historic preservation plan, a master plan for historic preservation in the community. And it's become very clear to the planning department and the historical commission that a cohesive plan for all of the town's historical assets in order to establish strategies, actions, and priorities to not only protect our historical and cultural resources and characters, but also celebrate them into the future is a really clear and primary goal. So to that end, we're actually committed to bringing in an intern this summer who will be working with the planning department and the historical commission. She'll be working on helping us set up some of the groundwork that we'll need in order to seek some grant funding possibly, but generally work towards engaging some sort of consultative help in creating a preservation plan for the community. So we're really looking forward to that, because not only, as I mentioned, will it help with our 3A compliance process, but it'll also help beyond that into the future as we look to continuously protect, preserve, and celebrate our historic assets. So that's one of the threads of conversation that have really, that's arisen because of this. And we also, another element of conversation that's come up is around, as I've mentioned, architectural and design considerations, not only as it relates to 3A, but also on all planning projects. So there are several commission members for the Historical Commission who have worked over the past 6 months to a year to create a streetscapes guidelines document that is going to be useful not only for individual, as a reference, not only for individual homeowners and developers, but also for the town of Ipswich as a municipality, our utilities department, our public works department. The Historical Commission, and we've observed that planning around and to highlight and protect our historical assets is not always the primary goal of a lot of the planning work that both the town and individual homeowners undertake. And so how can we help work as partners with our fellow, town colleagues and departments and the residents in the community to ensure that all work in historic preservation and design guidelines are really a focus of planning projects. And the last sort of conversational thread that's cropped up as part of 3A is the relationship between housing and Ipswich's history. So it's a really interesting sociological conversation that started to arise in the Historical Commission and the Planning Department around how two of Ipswich's historic districts that are on the National Register, the Brownstocking Mill Historic District and the Ipswich Mills Historic District. Interestingly, at one time in Ipswich's past, Ipswich was the largest producer of stockings in the entire world. So we, as part of those districts, were protected and put on the historical register because of the mill buildings and the mill worker housing. Really interesting communities and architectural designs that cropped up as a result of that workforce related housing. So the Historical Commission is talking about how workforce housing in the community is obviously historically significant, but has also played a really important role in shaping Ipswich's trajectory as a community and what is Ipswich's present day state. So to value our mill worker housing as part of 3A, we want to protect these real property and historical assets because they're located entirely within our station area. But we also are starting to have the conversation that by maintaining this housing and continuing to allow for more workforce and affordable housing for our working Ipswich population, we're strengthening and preserving this aspect of our history because we're continuing to maintain dedication to housing workers. So the summer intern that's coming in, a lot of the project work is going to be around working to preserve, celebrate, and into the future protect, and foster more a celebration of our immigrant population and our underrepresented populations, and how we really want to advance that history. So we're just getting started. I've so appreciated Jake speaking about Brookline, because I think this is an interesting foil to Brookline's work as sort of the end goal that we're working towards, but we're at the preliminary stages here. And of course, further conversations and elements of historic preservation will crop up as part of our 3A process. And our planning department, our historical commission are really looking forward to continue to focus on our historic assets and preservation, and are viewing 3A as a way to advance and continue our legacy of workforce and affordable housing. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity, and hopefully, we can be back at a future EMHCC meeting to talk about the end state that we've gotten to next year, a la Brookline. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Andrea. That was really good. Thank you to our 3 speakers and everything. So now we are going to get to the Q&A part. We already have some questions coming in. I will say that as you put your questions in the chat, we are going to try and get to as many as we can. We might not get to all of them, and also try and make them a little more broad so that everyone can learn from them. If they're really hyper specific, we might not have the answer off the top of our head. And again, we're trying to use this to educate everyone. So the first question is, in Scituate, I think this one's for Nate for HLC. So in Scituate, multiple family housing was built right next to the MBTA station, and the town was informed that those 75 units would not count to the 3A request because retail space is located on the first floor. And they know Senator O'Connor was working on a solution, but didn't know if you had any more information about how the issue was resolved. But I would also say to Nate, if you could use this to talk about how 3A is also not actually a counting requirement of current buildings on a lot, I think that would be really helpful to everyone on the call.
Sure, thanks. This is a great question. And particularly the retail and mixed use component is a very common area of discussion when it comes to implementing 3A. And to Lindsay's point, I want to kind of address 2 components of this question. And I think I can start with the first one because or I guess this is the second one. The capacity, the existing units. This is a really important thing to understand about the way that Section 3A works. The zoning requirement is completely agnostic to existing development on the ground. When we talk about this idea of unit capacity, we're asking how many units are allowed to be built according to the zoning. So if you have a parcel that has 100 existing units on it and the zoning says you can build 1,000 units, the capacity is 1,000. If the zoning says you can build 0 units, the capacity is 0. So realistically, though, there is a relationship between the existing units and the zoning. If the zoning, for example, allows 200 units and there are 100 units now, then you might estimate maybe there could be 100 more. But we don't specifically count existing units. I know that concept's a little academic, but I hope it makes some sense. Addressing the retail issue. So again, it comes down not to what's on the ground, but to what's allowed under the zoning. So it is true that the legislation, the actual statute, requires multifamily housing as of right, different than mixed use development. So if the zoning itself requires first floor commercial or retail components, it's not multifamily housing as of right. So we can't qualify that, so to speak, under Section 3A. But the presence of that retail there now is not a problem as long as the multifamily housing is allowed to be built under the zoning. And furthermore, it's the only requirement, the only prohibition is mandating the first floor commercial. There are a lot of zoning strategies that you can use to incentivize a first floor retail component. And I know that that's not always perfect for everybody. A lot of folks do want to require it. And in those locations, it might make more sense not to put a 3A district right there. But there's certainly no prohibition on existing retail first floor components, and there's not a prohibition on allowing them or incentivizing them either. It just can't be a mandatory requirement in the zoning.
Okay, thank you. So we have another question from Dolly, which I think we sort of just got to part of it. But it is, can you have the type of shape requirements that Jake was talking outside of a historic district? So their town only has one bus line running along the main street, and in a lot of people's minds, that's only one place for the town to have sort of 3A housing is the highway business district, though I would suggest, you can be very creative with 3A, I feel. And the town wanted to require mixed use in their rezoning in order to preserve the businesses and walkability, and was told that was not allowable, but I think Nathan just answered that. But the end question is, could we update to have a shape form-based zoning to have a better sense of what could or could not be built on the streetscape? Sort of opening this up to everyone, but my understanding is it doesn't have to be just a historic district, right? Like you can have form-based codes, you can have design guidelines anywhere in town. That is up to the town to decide. Does anyone else want to add anything to that from the speaker panel?
I want to add quickly, when it comes to a district compliance application for a community, and when that community is using our compliance model that kind of determines if you're meeting those numerical standards. Form-based code is tricky on the compliance model, but it's allowed, and we want to work with you to figure out the best way to help the model interpret what the zoning parameters are there. We love form-based code, and there's no rule against using it, certainly, is what I would say.
And I just want to put in a plug too. Brookline and Ipswich were both really using survey work and National Register nominations. So one thread that I would highlight here is to really focus and make sure your community has good survey work. Make sure you know what your buildings are in your community and in the areas that you're looking at. Having current inventory forms can help you develop something like form-based code. It can give you a resource when you're really thinking about your buildings and the history of your community and what you want to preserve, what you maybe don't need to preserve as much, or what you can be a little more flexible on. And it can also help to show you different kinds of multifamily housing that might have existed in your community previously that you may want to use as models moving forward. So for example, in Ipswich, looking at the multifamily housing that's around those mills, are those models that could be replicated in other areas of the community that would fit in well with the existing land use patterns of the community? So I know I always sound like a broken record promoting survey work, but it really is kind of the basis of all historic preservation work. So I would encourage your communities, to consider updating your survey work. At the MHC, we do offer our survey and planning grants in the fall. So again, if you're interested in doing that, certainly reach out to me or reach out to someone at MHC and we can talk about that.
Perfect. So we have another question that I'm going to tack on another question that I've heard before. So how does 3A integrate with existing local historic districts made up of single family structure on larger lots? And also, if towns have questions about how 3A intersects with local historic districts or architectural preservation districts or any other historic preservation considerations, do they reach out to HLC or do they reach out to MHC? Which acronym do they go for? Nate, I don't know if you want to handle that one.
I'm sorry, I was reading the chat.
So this is the one about how does 3A integrate with existing local historic districts made up of single family structures on larger lots?
Yeah, I think it's kind of related to the next one too, of how it affects the capacity in the district. So I think from our standpoint, first of all, like I tried to emphasize in my part of the presentation, there's always an opportunity, if you don't want overlap, not to have overlap between the districts. But from listening to the other speakers, there's also the great opportunity to intentionally have overlap for a positive result. And when that's the case, I think what EOHLC is focused on in determining compliance is whether the rules of the historic district would mean that the number of units that could be produced in the zoning is different than the number of units that could be produced based on the rules of the historic district. And so when that's the case, we have to take that into account in terms of evaluating for 3A compliance, but we're not evaluating the historic district itself in any way. So I hope that's helpful. We're just focused on determining how many units of housing are allowed in the zoning for the district. And so when there's overlap, we might take into account how the historic district could affect that capacity.
I think a good example might be that if you have that district, a local historic district, that's a bunch of single family houses on large lots, and you rezone it and say that the zoning allows for, 25 units per acre or something like that. But again, it's a local historic district with single family houses. You're likely not going to be able to construct 25 units on those acres. And so I think, Nate, that would be an example of a situation where that would ultimately be not compliant. But if the zoning was saying that, you could put multifamily into these existing houses and the zoning would allow, 2 or 3 units per acre in a local historic district, that might be a more reasonable thing where the zoning and a local historic district are sort of supporting each other and it would be compliant.
I'm going to give the next question to Andrea Bates, though anyone else can also jump in on this one. So the question is, would you say that including a historic preservation representative on 3A working group is important?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely focused that that was actually when the planning department was starting to theorize around how we wanted to approach 3A work last fall. And we ultimately ended, up on wanting to create a task force appointed by the town manager and have that group focus on 3A work supported by the planning department. One of the first participants that we identified was someone from our historical commission, because we really felt that given the significant intersection between our town center and our historical real property assets, we needed someone from the commission involved from the get-go, because we wanted to ensure that historic preservation considerations are and will continue to be a part of our 3A compliance process. And the way we felt best to do that in order to, Ipswich, as I'm sure many communities struggles with ensuring that we're bringing the right members of our boards, commissions, and committees into processes at the right time. And this, there has been criticism in the past that we don't do that early enough. So we really wanted to focus on our 3A response, having that happen from the inception of that process. And interestingly, that's really dovetailed with other projects that are currently happening in the community. So for example, that streetscapes guidelines guide that I referenced earlier that several of our historical commissioners have put together. We were able to get that in front of all town department directors. And what's come out of that is an interesting conversation. Ipswich, one of the main historic streets in our town center is called High Street, and it's actually located in our architectural preservation district. And High Street is exploring, our utilities and public works departments are exploring some underground. I won't bore you with the work, but they're talking about digging up the street, improving infrastructure, and also improving the streetscape. And because we were able to bring the streetscapes guidelines document and the historical and architectural preservation district commissions into that process earlier, we're now going to be partners throughout that specific work streetscape product that will occur. So it's not 3A related, but we are seeing that by focusing on this and having a historical commission, historical preservation lens into all, infusing that into all of these planning projects is really integrally important for the protection and the elevation of our historic streetscape. So I hope that helps, but I would definitely, I would really encourage attempting to include historical preservation aspects and representatives early in the process. And we found that that's worked well for us so far.
Yeah, no, it's been very interesting how 3A has sort of launched different ways for the town of Ipswich to think about historic preservation and bringing historic preservationists, the Historical Commission, the Architectural Preservation District Commission into these conversations that otherwise hadn't been brought in, right? Sort of the forgotten commissions in terms of it's not the planning board, it's not the select board, things like that. I did have a request, Jake, if you could actually answer that question too in terms of Brookline and everything.
Yeah, so thankfully, the senior planner who's kind of been coordinating the effort for the 3A compliance has been very persistent with keeping preservation involved throughout the entire process. So what that looks like in Brookline is a lot of meetings. She met with the chairs independently. She's presented before the commission numerous times. Once these standards are in draft form, she and I will bring them before the Preservation Commission and the public. We'll invite all the residents and kind of present them to make sure they're involved. Of course, Brookline is full of ad hoc communities, so I'm sure that any sort of 3A committee that arises will have a delegate from preservation, or at least significant input from the Preservation Commission.
Excellent. So we have another question about historic buildings that are not in historic districts, but fall within a 3A district. Are they still protected by demolition delay law? And are these taken into consideration by the 3A review? I don't know if Nate or Jen want to jump in with any thoughts, or anyone else.
I can jump in. I mean, demolition delay is, it's a building permit process, I guess. It's not, it has nothing to do necessarily with what you're allowed to build on the site. So I'm not sure, we haven't talked with EOHLC yet about how that would interplay, but I don't think it would, because it's, it's something that most communities have, or many communities in Massachusetts have at this point. And ultimately, yes, it's a delay, but it's, 12 months and 1 day, you can demolish the building. So it doesn't, you can still build whatever you want by right at that point. So I don't see how it would have an impact on 3A. You'd still have to go through your demolition delay process.
Yeah, we've thought about it a little bit, and we've looked at Brookline's, and I pretty much said that process is okay. I don't want to speak with too much specificity because you never know what exists from one community to another. So I don't want to make a sweeping rule about the process, but I think that Jen's answer is pretty much in line with our thinking on the subject.
Sort of going along with that, are communities concerned that the density allowance will encourage demolition? I don't know if Andrea or Jake or Nate or Jen wanna.
I mean, I think density, I think that is kind of the point, is to, encourage more density, and it could certainly encourage demolition. But I think some of the things that we've talked about here in terms of having, good design guidelines will be helpful for your communities, but also looking at things like historic rehabilitation tax credits. Those are available to properties in National Register districts. Both Brookline and Ipswich, the areas that they're looking at, were National Register districts. And those can be one way to encourage the preservation of buildings. Often those rehabilitation tax credits make the difference between a demolition or preserving a building for a developer. So again, actively pursuing survey, actively pursuing National Register listings, so that you have that as an option when someone is considering demolition for a site. You can say, well, if you make it apartments, if it's going to be, convert this building to apartments, they could be using historic rehabilitation tax credits. So, thinking about some of the other things, not just focusing on the potential loss of the building, but how can you encourage its active reuse?
And just to follow up on Jen, I think it's really important to understand what it is you might be demolishing, because what you might be demolishing may or may not have significance. I've worked in communities that are largely 1 story now in their downtowns, but when they were fully built out, they were 3 and 4 stories, and what's left is a partial demolition of a former historic structure. So it can be sometimes difficult to convince a community that actually when your downtown area or your commercial district was fully functioning and healthy, it actually had 3 or 4 stories. Now you have single stories, which is not historically its most densely developed. And just to really be thoughtful about understanding what is your existing fabric and why it is what it is, and really take that into consideration. Just because it's there doesn't mean automatically that it's of historic value or couldn't be demolished and produced or replaced with something that actually is more along the lines of what had traditionally been in the district prior to other demolitions in the past.
Thanks. We're going to get ready to, I think, wrap up, but we have one last question that we'll get to today. And that is for Brookline and for Ipswich, and even MHC for Jen if she wants to. What advice for communities that lack the collaboration that Brookline and Ipswich have can you give, right? That their community has things sort of imposed on them and that these commissions are not speaking to each other. What advice would you give on how to enable and uplift that type of collaboration?
I can respond first. That's a great question. And I don't want to overstate that as a community, you know, particularly prior to the release of the final guidelines for the Section 3A MBTA communities, there was and continues to be a lot of skepticism around 3A. And so I think that, you know, in the collaborative nature of the work that we're doing has been a really mindful process. We did not start here. There's been a lot of concerted effort about first having, you know, if you have either planning department staff or planning boards that lead your land use planning, and will be working on your response to 3A, ensuring that those folks are really well versed on what this is and what this isn't, because a lot of the skepticism, I think, around this had to do with some misinformation around 3A initially. So that really prevented any collaborative work, because there was a lot of, and as I said, continues to be some level of nervousness about this for the community, and some real feelings of some folks who are worried about how allowing for a 3A district will impact our historic assets. But I think that in order to kind of build the collaboration that we've gotten to and look to continue to grow and foster in the coming months, at least in our community, it's really been about listening and trying to help understand how we can answer some of those concerns that, frankly, as planning staff, we also have. We're concerned about, you know, protecting our assets. And so we want to ensure that we are planning for that through some, and Jen has really been helpful in calling out, like, the survey work we're trying to continue to start to implement, and ensuring that we have a really clear process over the next year to be, you know, continue to be collaborative with the town boards and committees in our community. So I think it takes just a lot of conversation. I'd recommend just a lot of opportunity for talking and listening, and that's what's been helpful so far for us, I think.
And I'll echo what Andrea is talking about in terms of conversation. You know, I think a lot of historical commissions get very focused on, you know, certain things that they have to do, or, you know, administering their demolition delay bylaw, or, you know, reviewing their local historic district, or, you know, if you have a museum with a collection, maybe focusing on that. And, you know, you start to kind of lose the forest through the trees. You know, you forget that the rest of the community exists, or that there's historic resources in the entire community when you're just focusing on one very small thing. So I encourage folks to kind of branch out a bit and, you know, think about other projects and things that are going on in your community. and really just, show up and give your opinion, whether those boards want to hear it or not. You as a town board, you can comment on projects, you can comment on things that are going on in the public. You can send a letter to the planning board if there's a project that you don't like. You can send a letter to the Economic Development Committee if there's, something that you don't like that they're doing. And so I would just, encourage you to do that, even if they don't want to hear it necessarily. You can still, put yourself out there, and eventually, hopefully it will start to click that, oh, wait, these folks have an opinion and they may be able to help us with this other project that we're working on. So sometimes it's, taking that step back from those things that you think you should be working on, and really, kind of refocusing and, sort of giving your opinion on other projects in town. As Andrea noted, a DPW streetscape project. Most historical commissions would maybe be like, well, why do I want to comment on, them, digging up the road to put, the electrical lines underground? Well, you might want to, because they might be changing the sidewalks, or they might be changing the street lamps, or the, street lights, or, traffic system, or things like that. There may be things that you'd want to comment on. So just, putting yourself out there for those, in those other situations, will help people realize that they should be coming to you when there are bigger projects that are going to impact historic resources, even if it's not a demolition or something in a local historic district.
Yeah, and in Brookline, kind of piggybacking off of what Andrea said, in the past we have kind of felt excluded or, siloed into certain projects or whatever. And this has actually been a great experience for us. The senior planner in the department, Maria Morelli, has made sure that we are very involved in the process, but also has kind of given us as preservation planners the tools to kind of insert ourselves into these larger conversations. And one thing that I think has been really, really helpful is keeping the Preservation Commission informed at each step of the way. Make them the go-to people, make them the beacon that draws everyone in. So if people have questions, they don't necessarily need to come to staff who is kind of siloed in an office, but you can facilitate these conversations on the street or on like Facebook forums, anywhere. So I think that's kind of been a great thing to come from this.
Well, thank you for everyone for joining us. Thank you to our speakers, to Nate, Jake, and Andrea. We really, really appreciate you sharing your time and your expertise. And it will be really, I think, really fun to sort of watch how these different projects go. Because again, Brookline has a different deadline than Ipswich and everything. And just to sort of see how these projects evolve over time. And again, I just want to say that this is being recorded. It will be posted to the MAPC YouTube page and to our EMHCC landing page and everything, with the presentations in slide form of our three speakers and everything, with different links. So please, if you know people who weren't able to attend today, have them, sort of watch it after. They can explore these resources. We are all here, I think, for everyone, even after today. So if you have questions, please email myself, Jen, or Jeff, or, reach out to Nate or Jake or Andrea if you have questions about 3A or their projects and everything. All the contact information will be on that website. So thank you everyone for joining us. And again, October 3rd, Tuesday, October 3rd at 10 a.m. will be the next EMHCC and everything. It is also Archaeology Month, along with many other months. So we're very excited to kick off the month in this way. So thank you.